In the testosterone-fueled world of military dining halls, respect is earned through action, not rank. What happens when a cocky Marine decides to test someone he assumes is just another rookie, only to discover he's picked a fight with a decorated Navy SEAL who's already proven herself in the deadliest combat zones on Earth? Sometimes the most dangerous warriors come in unexpected packages, and sometimes a single lunch break can end a career before it truly begins. This is the story of Lieutenant Sarah Chen, a woman whose quiet demeanor masked a lethal skill set that would turn one Marine's world upside down in the most public way possible. The morning sun cast long shadows across Camp Pendleton as Lieutenant Sarah Chen stepped off the transport truck, her sea bag slung over one shoulder with practiced ease. At 5 feet 4 inches, with her black hair pulled back in regulation style, she didn't look like the kind of person who could strike fear into the hearts of terrorists across 3 continents. The other passengers barely glanced her way as they dispersed toward their respective assignments, each focused on their own military duties and destinations. Sarah had grown accustomed to being underestimated. Throughout her 8 years in the Navy, from her early days as a fresh-faced recruit to her recent graduation from the most grueling military training program in the world, people consistently failed to see past her unassuming exterior. They saw a petite Asian woman with calm eyes and a soft voice, not someone who had spent the last 3 years conducting classified operations in hostile territories where one mistake meant death. The transfer to Camp Pendleton represented a brief respite from overseas deployments, a chance to train new recruits and share her expertise with other special operations units. Her commanding officer had explained that inter-service cooperation was becoming increasingly important in modern warfare, and her experience would be invaluable in preparing Marines for the realities of asymmetric combat. Sarah understood the assignment's importance, even if it meant trading the adrenaline of active missions for the structured routine of stateside duty. As she walked toward the administrative building to complete her check-in process, Sarah noticed the curious glances from Marines going about their daily routines. Camp Pendleton was predominantly a Marine Corps installation, and Navy personnel were less common, especially female Navy personnel assigned to work closely with combat units. She had experienced similar scrutiny at other joint bases, and it never bothered her much. People would form their opinions based on assumptions, and eventually, those opinions would change based on her actions and performance. The administrative process took most of the morning, involving the usual paperwork, briefings about base procedures, and meetings with various department heads who would coordinate her training responsibilities. By noon, Sarah had received her temporary quarters assignment, base access credentials, and a thick folder containing information about the units she would be working with over the coming months. Her stomach reminded her that she had skipped breakfast, in her eagerness to complete the check-in process efficiently. The main dining facility buzzed with activity, as Marines grabbed lunch between training exercises and administrative duties. Sarah collected a tray and moved through the serving line, selecting a grilled chicken sandwich, side salad, and bottled water. The conversations around her created a familiar backdrop of military life, mixing official business with good-natured complaining about everything from the weather to upcoming field exercises. Finding an empty table near the windows, Sarah settled in with her meal and began reviewing some of the briefing materials from her folder. She preferred to eat alone when possible, using mealtimes to catch up on reading or simply enjoy a few minutes of quiet reflection. The dining hall's energy didn't bother her, but she had learned to create mental space for herself even in crowded environments. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez had been watching the new arrival since she entered the dining facility. At 6'2", with the build of someone who spent serious time in the weight room, Rodriguez commanded attention wherever he went. His broad shoulders and aggressive demeanor had earned him respect among younger Marines who looked up to him as an example of military bearing and physical prowess. What they didn't know was that Rodriguez's impressive physique masked a deep insecurity about his actual combat experience and capabilities. Despite his imposing appearance and confident swagger, Rodriguez had spent most of his 6-year Marine Corps career in support roles and stateside assignments. While his peers deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq, accumulating combat experience and earning recognition for their service under fire, Rodriguez found himself assigned to training units, logistics operations, and other rear echelon positions that kept him far from actual combat zones. He compensated for this perceived shortcoming by projecting an image of toughness and by picking fights with anyone he considered weak or undeserving of respect. The sight of a small Navy officer sitting alone in what Rodriguez considered Marine territory triggered all of his insecurities and aggressive impulses. He saw an easy target, someone he could intimidate to demonstrate his dominance to the younger Marines who frequently sought his approval and guidance. Rodriguez had built his reputation on these kinds of confrontations, carefully selecting opponents he could overwhelm through size and intimidation rather than actual skill or experience. Rodriguez stood up from his table where he had been eating with 3 junior Marines who looked up to him as a mentor and role model. Lance Corporal Peterson, Private First Class Williams, and Lance Corporal Jackson had all heard stories about Rodriguez's supposed toughness and combat readiness, though none of them had ever seen him in actual action. They followed their unofficial leader with eager anticipation, expecting to witness another demonstration of his dominance over someone foolish enough to challenge Marine superiority. Sarah noticed the group approaching but didn't look up from her reading material immediately. Years of training had taught her to maintain awareness of her surroundings while appearing relaxed and non-threatening. She could sense the aggressive energy radiating from the larger man leading the group, and her mind automatically began assessing potential threats and escape routes. These mental calculations happened unconsciously, the result of countless hours spent in environments where situational awareness meant the difference between life and death. Rodriguez stopped directly in front of Sarah's table, his shadow falling across her briefing papers. The 3 junior Marines flanked him, creating an intimidating presence that drew attention from nearby diners. Several other Marines at surrounding tables stopped their conversations to watch the developing confrontation, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Well, Rodriguez said in a voice loud enough to carry across the immediate area. Looks like the Navy sent us another desk jockey who thinks she belongs in the same dining hall as real warriors. His tone carried the mocking confidence of someone who had never faced serious opposition, the swagger of a playground bully who had grown up but never matured past the mindset of picking on smaller targets. Sarah looked up from her papers with calm, dark eyes that showed no trace of fear or concern. She had faced down hardened terrorists in situations where her life hung in the balance, and a posturing Marine in a dining hall represented no real threat to her safety or well-being. Her voice remained steady and polite when she responded, "I'm just trying to eat lunch and review some work materials. I don't want any trouble." Rodriguez interpreted her calm response as weakness, confirmation that his initial assessment had been correct. He leaned forward, placing both hands on her table and bringing his face closer to hers in a classic intimidation tactic. "Trouble, lady? You came into the wrong place if you wanted to avoid trouble. This is Marine country, and we don't appreciate having Navy personnel taking up space that should go to real military members." The junior Marines behind Rodriguez exchanged glances, some looking uncomfortable with the increasingly aggressive confrontation but unwilling to challenge their leader's behavior. Other diners had stopped eating entirely, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Several Marines sitting nearby began reaching for their phones, sensing that whatever happened next might be worth recording for posterity. Sarah remained perfectly still, her expression unchanged despite the aggressive posturing taking place inches from her face. She had encountered similar behavior from insurgents trying to provoke reactions during interrogations, and Rodriguez's amateur intimidation tactics paled in comparison to what she had experienced in actual combat zones. Her training kicked in automatically, keeping her heart rate steady while her mind evaluated the situation and potential responses. "I understand you feel strongly about this," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying no trace of fear or aggression. "But I'm here on official orders, and I'd prefer to avoid any conflicts during my assignment here." She spoke with the measured tone of someone accustomed to de-escalating tense situations, though she remained fully prepared for the possibility that Rodriguez might escalate beyond verbal confrontation. Rodriguez's face reddened with anger at what he perceived as condescension from someone he considered inferior in every way. The calm confidence in Sarah's voice challenged his worldview about how these confrontations should proceed, and her refusal to show fear or submission threatened the image he had carefully cultivated among his followers. "You'd prefer to avoid conflicts? What kind of military officer are you? Maybe the Navy's standards have dropped so low they're commissioning people who are afraid of a little confrontation." The insult hung in the air as several more Marines turned their attention to the developing situation. Sarah recognized the moment when verbal aggression would likely transition to physical confrontation, and she began making subtle adjustments to her posture and positioning. Years of training in close-quarters combat had taught her to prepare for violence while maintaining the appearance of calm submission, a technique that often gave her crucial advantages when situations turned dangerous. Rodriguez straightened up and crossed his arms, his impressive physique on full display as he prepared to deliver what he expected would be the crushing blow to this Navy officer's confidence. "Tell you what, Navy girl, since you're so concerned about avoiding conflict, how about you just pack up your little papers and find somewhere else to eat? Maybe the Officers Club has a nice quiet corner where you won't have to worry about real Marines bothering your important paperwork." Sarah continued eating her sandwich with deliberate calm, taking small bites while considering her options. She could leave as Rodriguez suggested, avoiding confrontation but establishing herself as someone who could be bullied and intimidated by any Marine who felt like asserting dominance. Alternatively, she could stand her ground and risk escalating the situation beyond verbal threats. Her experience suggested that bullies like Rodriguez rarely back down from confrontations unless forced to reassess their assumptions about their intended victims. The dining hall had grown quieter as more Marines became aware of the confrontation unfolding near the windows. Sarah could feel dozens of eyes watching her reaction, waiting to see how the small Navy officer would respond to Rodriguez's aggressive challenge. She understood that her response in this moment would likely determine how she was treated by Marines throughout her assignment at Camp Pendleton. Rodriguez waited for her response with the confidence of someone who had never encountered serious resistance to his intimidation tactics. The junior Marines behind him shifted uncomfortably, beginning to sense that something about this confrontation felt different from Rodriguez's usual demonstrations of dominance. Sarah's calm demeanor and complete lack of visible fear didn't match the pattern they had observed in previous incidents. Sarah finished chewing her bite of sandwich and looked up at Rodriguez with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the encounter. Her voice remained steady and polite when she finally responded, but something in her tone suggested that the dynamic was about to shift in ways Rodriguez couldn't anticipate. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," she said, using his rank and name in a way that surprised him since he hadn't introduced himself. "I appreciate your concern about dining hall seating arrangements, but I think there might be some misunderstanding about why I'm here and what my background involves." Rodriguez's confidence faltered slightly when Sarah used his name and rank, though he couldn't understand how she had obtained that information. The brief moment of uncertainty passed quickly, replaced by renewed aggression as he interpreted her knowledge as some kind of threat or challenge to his authority. His face grew redder as he leaned back toward her table, determined to reassert control over the situation. "I don't care what kind of background you think you have, Navy," Rodriguez snarled, his voice growing louder and attracting even more attention from the surrounding diners. "Background doesn't mean anything if you can't back it up when it counts. And looking at you, I'm betting you've never been in a real fight in your entire soft little life." Sarah set down her sandwich and looked directly into Rodriguez's eyes with an expression that remained calm but somehow seemed to intensify. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible to casual observers, but Rodriguez felt a chill run down his spine as he stared into eyes that had seen things he couldn't imagine. For just a moment, his bravado wavered as some primal part of his brain recognized that he was looking at something dangerous. "You might be surprised," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying undertones that suggested depths Rodriguez couldn't fathom. "But I'd rather not find out if that's true. I'm just here to do my job and work with Marines like yourself to improve our joint training capabilities. That seems more productive than proving points about who's tougher than whom." The reasonable tone of her response infuriated Rodriguez, who interpreted her calm demeanor as mockery of his aggressive posturing. He had built his reputation on intimidating people until they either backed down or lashed out in ways that justified his overwhelming response. Sarah's refusal to follow either script threatened the foundation of his self-image and the respect he commanded from junior Marines. Lance Corporal Peterson, who had been watching the confrontation with growing unease, leaned forward and whispered, "Sergeant, maybe we should just let it go. She's not bothering anybody, and if she's here on official orders," his suggestion died under Rodriguez's withering glare, a look that promised serious consequences for anyone who questioned his judgment or authority in front of potential rivals. "Peterson, did I ask for your input?" Rodriguez snapped without taking his eyes off Sarah. "This Navy officer thinks she can waltz into our dining hall and act like she belongs here with real warriors. I think it's time she learned about the difference between whatever soft training the Navy provides and the kind of hard preparation that makes actual fighters. Sarah recognized the escalation in Rodriguez's tone and body language, noting the way his hands had begun to clench into fists and how his stance had shifted into something more aggressive. She had seen this pattern countless times in various contexts, from barroom confrontations to hostile interrogations, and she knew that Rodriguez was approaching the point where verbal intimidation would give way to physical action. "Staff Sergeant," Sarah said, using his rank again while maintaining her seated position and calm tone. "I understand you feel strongly about maintaining standards and respect within your community. That's actually something I admire about Marine culture. But I'm wondering if you might be making some assumptions about my training and experience that aren't quite accurate." Rodriguez's face twisted with anger at what he perceived as Sarah's continued condescension and refusal to show proper deference to his superior size and aggressive manner. "Assumptions? Lady, I can see everything I need to know just by looking at you. You're small, you're soft, and you're trying to hide behind fancy words instead of backing up your position with action. That tells me everything about what kind of warrior you really are." The insult struck at something deeper than personal pride, touching on years of proving herself in environments where gender and size were constant obstacles to overcome. Sarah had endured similar challenges throughout her military career, from boot camp instructors who assumed she would wash out, to special operations trainers who initially questioned whether she belonged in their programs. Each time she had responded not with words but with performance that silenced critics and earned grudging respect from the hardest men in the military. Sarah stood up slowly, her movement fluid and controlled in a way that suggested extensive training in body mechanics and combat positioning. Even standing, she remained significantly smaller than Rodriguez, but something about her posture and presence seemed to fill more space than her physical dimensions would suggest. The change was subtle but noticeable to anyone paying attention to the confrontation. "You know what, Staff Sergeant?" Sarah said, her voice remaining steady but carrying a new edge that hadn't been present before. "Maybe you're right about assumptions. Maybe I have been making some assumptions about you too. I assumed you were the kind of Marine who earned respect through leadership and example rather than intimidation and bullying." The word bullying hit Rodriguez like a physical blow, striking at the heart of his insecurities about his own combat record and leadership style. Several nearby Marines exchanged glances at Sarah's direct challenge, recognizing that the confrontation had moved beyond simple intimidation into more dangerous territory. Rodriguez's hands clenched into obvious fists as his face flushed with rage at being called out so directly. "Bullying?" Rodriguez's voice rose to a level that could be heard throughout the dining hall, ensuring that everyone present would witness his response to Sarah's challenge. "You want to see bullying, Navy girl? How about we step outside and I show you what real Marines do when someone disrespects us in front of our brothers?" The challenge hung in the air as Marines throughout the dining hall stopped what they were doing, to focus entirely on the confrontation. Several pulled out phones to record what they sensed would become a significant incident, while others began placing quiet bets on the outcome of any physical confrontation between the imposing Marine Staff Sergeant and the diminutive Navy officer. Sarah looked around the dining hall, noting the dozens of faces watching expectantly for her response. She understood that backing down now would establish her as someone who could be intimidated and challenged by anyone who felt like testing the new Navy personnel. At the same time, she recognized that accepting Rodriguez's challenge could lead to consequences that might affect her assignment and career. "I'd prefer to keep this professional and handle any disagreements through proper channels," Sarah said, though her tone suggested that she was fully prepared for whatever Rodriguez might choose to do next. "But if you feel that physical confrontation is the only way to resolve our differences, I won't run away from that either." Rodriguez smiled for the first time since approaching her table, interpreting her response as capitulation disguised as false bravado. He had seen similar responses from other targets of his intimidation, people who tried to save face while essentially admitting defeat. "That's what I thought. All talk and no action, just like every other Navy desk jockey they've sent us over the years." Private First Class Williams, who had been watching with the eager anticipation of someone expecting to see their hero dominate another victim, suddenly felt uncertain about what he was witnessing. Something about the Navy officer's demeanor didn't match Rodriguez's characterization, and her calm acceptance of his challenge seemed more ominous than encouraging for Rodriguez's chances of easy victory. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out her military identification card. placing it on the table where Rodriguez could see her name, rank, and service designation clearly. "Before this goes any further, Staff Sergeant, I think you should know exactly who you're challenging. My name is Lieutenant Sarah Chen, and I'm assigned here as a training advisor for Special Operations Units." Rodriguez glanced at the identification card but didn't immediately grasp its significance beyond confirming that she was indeed a Navy officer. The words "Special Operations" registered dimly, but his anger and commitment to the confrontation prevented him from processing what that designation might mean about Sarah's actual background and capabilities. "Special Operations?" Rodriguez laughed, a harsh sound that carried no genuine humor. "What kind of special operations does the Navy think a little girl like you could handle? Filing paperwork faster than normal? Making coffee for the real operators?" Several Marines in the audience winced at Rodriguez's dismissive comments, recognizing that he was venturing into territory that could have serious professional consequences, regardless of how the physical confrontation might unfold. Insulting another service member's qualifications and assignments crossed lines that even the most aggressive Marines understood could lead to formal disciplinary action. Sarah picked up her identification card and returned it to her pocket, her movements deliberate and controlled. When she looked back at Rodriguez, something had changed in her expression, though she still appeared calm and composed. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, I'm going to give you one more chance to reconsider this course of action. Not because I'm afraid of the consequences, but because I think you might not fully understand what those consequences could be." Rodriguez's laughter grew louder and more mocking, encouraging similar responses from some of the junior Marines who were following his lead despite growing uncertainty about the situation's direction. "Consequences? The only consequences I'm worried about are what happens to Navy personnel who think they can disrespect Marines on our own base. Are you going to keep talking, or are we going to settle this like warriors?" The formal challenge had been issued and acknowledged, creating a situation that would be difficult for either participant to back away from without losing face in front of the assembled Marines. Sarah understood that Rodriguez had probably participated in similar confrontations many times before, always emerging victorious through size and aggression rather than actual skill or training. She also understood that his assumptions about her capabilities were about to be tested in the most direct way possible. Sarah began removing items from her pockets, placing her wallet, phone, and other personal belongings on the table in the methodical manner of someone preparing for physical activity. Her movements were efficient and practiced, suggesting familiarity with pre-combat routines that went far beyond casual bar fights or training exercises. "All right, Staff Sergeant," Sarah said, her voice carrying a new note of finality that silenced the conversations around them. "If you're absolutely certain this is how you want to handle our disagreement, then let's step outside and settle it. But I want to make sure you understand that once we start, I won't hold back just because we're on the same side ultimately." Rodriguez's grin widened as he interpreted her statement as desperate bravado from someone trying to save face while preparing for inevitable defeat. He had heard similar tough talk from other targets of his aggression, and it had never translated into actual resistance to his dominance. "Don't worry about holding back, Navy. I'll try not to hurt you too badly, but I can't make any promises once we get started." The crowd of Marines began following Sarah and Rodriguez toward the dining hall exit, their excitement palpable as they anticipated witnessing what they expected would be a one-sided demonstration of Marine superiority over Navy personnel. Several continued recording with their phones while others sent quick messages to friends who might want to witness the confrontation. As they moved toward the door, Lance Corporal Jackson leaned toward Peterson and whispered, "Something doesn't feel right about this. Did you see how calm she stayed when Rodriguez was yelling at her? Most people would have been scared or angry, but she just looked, I don't know, like she was thinking about something else entirely." Peterson nodded, having noticed the same thing but unable to articulate his growing concern about what they were about to witness. "Yeah, and did you hear what she said about special operations? I thought that was just Navy SEAL stuff, but maybe there are other programs we don't know about." Their conversation was interrupted as the group reached the dining hall exit and prepared to move outside for what everyone expected would be a brief but decisive physical confrontation between the imposing Marine staff sergeant and the small Navy officer who had somehow provoked his aggressive attention. The afternoon sun blazed overhead as the crowd of Marines filed out of the dining hall, forming a rough circle in the open area behind the building. where unofficial disputes were sometimes settled away from the scrutiny of commanding officers. Rodriguez strutted into the center of the impromptu arena with the confidence of someone who had never lost a fight, his impressive physique on full display as he rolled his shoulders and cracked his knuckles in an intimidating display. Sarah walked calmly to the opposite side of the circle, her smaller frame dwarfed by Rodriguez's imposing presence, but her demeanor unchanged from the controlled composure she had maintained throughout their confrontation. She removed her uniform blouse, revealing a plain gray t-shirt that showed lean muscle definition across her shoulders and arms. The scars visible on her exposed forearms told stories that none of the watching Marines could decipher. Thin white lines that spoke of close encounters with bladed weapons and shrapnel. "Last chance to apologize and walk away, Navy girl," Rodriguez called out, his voice carrying across the circle to ensure maximum humiliation for his opponent. "I've been doing this a lot longer than you have, and I don't think you understand what you're getting yourself into." Sarah began a series of subtle stretches and movements that looked almost like warm-up exercises, but were actually combat preparation routines taught in the most elite military training programs. Her breathing remained controlled and steady, her heart rate unchanged despite the aggressive posturing from her much larger opponent. "Staff Sergeant, I tried to give you multiple opportunities to reconsider this course of action. What happens next is entirely your choice." The circle of Marines pressed closer, their excitement building as they anticipated what they expected would be a quick demonstration of Rodriguez's physical dominance. Several continued recording with their phones, while others provided commentary about the size difference and likely outcome of the confrontation. The general consensus among the spectators was that Rodriguez would end the fight quickly and decisively, probably with a single well-placed punch or takedown. Rodriguez began circling Sarah like a predator stalking prey, his movements aggressive and intimidating as he sought to provoke a reaction that would justify overwhelming force. "You know what your problem is, Navy? You've spent so much time behind a desk that you've forgotten what real combat looks like." Let me remind you. Without further warning, Rodriguez launched himself forward with surprising speed for someone of his size, attempting to grab Sarah in a bear hug that would allow him to use his superior weight and strength to end the confrontation immediately. His technique was crude but effective against smaller opponents who lacked proper training in defensive combat techniques. Sarah's response was so quick and fluid that several spectators later claimed they missed it entirely. Instead of retreating or attempting to block Rodriguez's charge, she stepped slightly to her left while simultaneously ducking under his outstretched arms. Her right hand shot forward in a precise strike that caught Rodriguez in the solar plexus with surgical accuracy, causing him to double over as the air rushed from his lungs. The watching Marines fell silent as Rodriguez stumbled backward, gasping for breath and looking confused about what had just happened. The speed and precision of Sarah's counterattack didn't match their expectations about how the confrontation should unfold, and several began to reassess their assumptions about the small Navy officer's capabilities. Rodriguez straightened up with effort, his face red from embarrassment as much as lack of oxygen. The single strike had been more effective than anything he had experienced in years of amateur fighting, delivered with a level of technical skill that suggested extensive training in combat techniques he didn't recognize. "You got lucky," he gasped, though uncertainty had crept into his voice for the first time. Sarah resumed her calm stance, showing no signs of exertion or excitement, despite having just demonstrated combat capabilities that clearly exceeded Rodriguez's expectations. "Staff Sergeant, this doesn't have to continue. We can call it even and go back to handling our disagreements through proper military channels." The offer of a graceful exit infuriated Rodriguez, who interpreted Sarah's calm demeanor as mockery of his inability to dominate what should have been an easy target. His pride and reputation were on the line in front of junior Marines who looked up to him as an example of military toughness, and backing down now would undermine everything he had built over years of intimidating weaker opponents. "This isn't over," Rodriguez snarled, wiping sweat from his forehead while preparing for another attack. "You might have gotten one cheap shot, but I'm going to show these Marines what happens when someone thinks they can embarrass a real warrior." Rodriguez's second attack was more cautious but equally unsuccessful. He attempted a series of punches and grappling moves that would have overwhelmed most untrained opponents, but Sarah seemed to anticipate each technique before he fully committed to it. She moved with the fluid grace of someone whose combat training had been tested in life-or-death situations, deflecting his attacks while delivering precise counterstrike that gradually wore down his energy and confidence. After several minutes of increasingly desperate attacks, Rodriguez found himself breathing heavily, while Sarah appeared as fresh and composed as when the confrontation had begun. The watching Marines had grown quiet as they witnessed their supposed champion being systematically outclassed by someone they had initially dismissed as weak and inexperienced. Lance Corporal Peterson leaned toward Jackson and whispered, "Dude, I don't think she's just Navy. Look how she moves."
"That's not normal military training." Jackson nodded, his attention focused on Sarah's footwork and positioning.
"Yeah, and did you see how she knew exactly where to hit him? It's like she's done this before against people who actually knew how to fight." Their conversation was interrupted as Rodriguez, desperate to salvage his reputation and authority, pulled a folding knife from his pocket and opened the blade with an audible click. The appearance of the weapon caused several Marines to step back instinctively while others reached for their phones to ensure they captured what was about to unfold. "Rodriguez, put that away," Peterson called out, his voice carrying genuine concern about the escalation from unarmed combat to potentially deadly force. This was supposed to be just a fight, not something that could get us all in serious trouble. Rodriguez ignored the warnings from his followers, his desperation overriding any consideration of consequences or military regulations. "She wants to fight like a real warrior? Then let's see how tough she is when the stakes get real." "Bucks!" Sarah's demeanor changed immediately upon seeing the knife, her posture shifting into something more aggressive and focused than anything the watching Marines had witnessed so far. The casual confidence she had displayed throughout the unarmed portion of the confrontation was replaced by the cold intensity of someone whose training had prepared her for exactly this kind of escalation. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Sarah said, her voice carrying a new authority that seemed to cut through the tension surrounding the circle of spectators. "Drawing a weapon on a fellow service member is a court-martial offense that will end your career regardless of what happens in the next few minutes. I strongly advise you to reconsider this decision." Rodriguez's response was to lunge forward with the knife extended, attempting to use the weapon's intimidation factor to force Sarah into submission or retreat. His technique with the blade was as crude as his unarmed combat skills, relying on aggression and the weapon's psychological impact rather than proper knife-fighting techniques. What happened next occurred so quickly that most spectators required multiple viewings of their phone recordings to understand the sequence of events. Sarah moved with the precision and speed of someone whose training had included extensive weapons disarmament techniques, practiced against opponents whose skill levels far exceeded Rodriguez's amateur attempts at knife combat. In a movement that lasted less than 3 seconds, Sarah deflected Rodriguez's knife attack, grabbed his wrist with both hands, and executed a joint lock that forced him to drop the weapon while simultaneously taking him to the ground. The technique was performed with such clinical efficiency that Rodriguez found himself face down on the asphalt with Sarah's knee pressed against his back before he fully understood what had happened. The silence that followed was broken only by Rodriguez's labored breathing and the sound of the dropped knife clattering across the pavement. Sarah maintained her position for several seconds, ensuring that Rodriguez understood his complete inability to resist her control, before releasing him and stepping back to allow him to stand. Rodriguez struggled to his feet, his face flushed with embarrassment, and his right wrist already showing signs of swelling from the joint lock that had forced him to drop his weapon. The watching Marines stared in stunned silence as they processed what they had just witnessed, the systematic dismantling of someone they had considered a formidable fighter by an opponent they had initially dismissed as weak and inexperienced. "I think that settles our disagreement, Staff Sergeant," Sarah said, her voice returning to the calm, professional tone she had maintained throughout their initial confrontation in the dining hall. "I hope we can work together more constructively from this point forward." Private First Class Williams, who had been Rodriguez's most enthusiastic supporter at the beginning of the confrontation, found his voice first among the stunned spectators. "Holy shit," he whispered, his eyes wide with amazement and newfound respect. "Who the hell is she?" The question hung in the air as Sarah walked over to retrieve her uniform blouse, preparing to return to the dining hall and finish her interrupted lunch. The casual way she handled the aftermath of completely dominating a larger, more aggressive opponent suggested that this kind of confrontation was routine rather than exceptional in her experience. Rodriguez remained where Sarah had released him, staring at the ground while processing the complete destruction of his reputation and self-image. The junior Marines who had followed him outside were backing away, their expressions showing a mixture of embarrassment for having supported him and awe at what they had witnessed from his opponent. Sarah paused before leaving the circle of spectators, her attention drawn by the sound of approaching vehicles that suggested their confrontation had attracted official attention. 3 military police vehicles were pulling into the parking area near the dining hall, their occupants clearly responding to reports of the incident that had just concluded. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Sarah said, her voice carrying a note of genuine concern despite everything that had transpired between them. "You're going to want to get that wrist looked at by medical personnel. Joint locks can cause damage that isn't immediately apparent, especially if you try to use the limb before it's properly healed." The approaching military police represented a new phase of consequences that would extend far beyond the immediate physical confrontation. Sarah understood that her actions would require extensive documentation and review, particularly given the weapons involvement and the number of witnesses who had recorded various portions of the incident. As the first military police officer approached the group, Sarah stood at attention and prepared to provide her account of the events that had led to Rodriguez lying defeated on the asphalt, with his reputation and career prospects in ruins around him. Master Sergeant David Thompson stepped out of the lead military police vehicle with the measured authority of someone who had investigated countless incidents involving disputes between service members. His 22 years in the Marine Corps had given him extensive experience in separating fact from fiction when emotions ran high and reputations were at stake. The scene before him presented familiar elements. A crowd of Marines gathered around 2 individuals who showed obvious signs of recent physical confrontation. What wasn't familiar was the calm demeanor of one participant and the shell-shocked expression of the other. Thompson had expected to find 2 hot-headed service members requiring separation and cooling-off periods, not the composed Navy officer standing at attention beside a Marine staff sergeant who appeared to be suffering from something more than simple embarrassment at losing a fight. "I'm Master Sergeant Thompson, Military Police," he announced to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying the authority that immediately dispersed most of the spectators back toward their normal duties. "I need to speak with the primary participants in whatever incident occurred here, and I'll need witness statements from anyone who observed the entire sequence of events." Sarah maintained her position at attention while Rodriguez slowly struggled to his feet, cradling his injured wrist against his chest. The physical evidence of their confrontation was minimal, beyond Rodriguez's obvious discomfort and the folding knife that still lay on the asphalt where it had fallen during Sarah's disarmament technique. Thompson's trained eye immediately noted the weapon and its position relative to the 2 service members, drawing conclusions about the incident's escalation that would prove crucial in his subsequent investigation. "Before we discuss what happened here, I need to secure that knife as evidence and ensure that anyone requiring medical attention receives appropriate care." Rodriguez's face flushed with renewed embarrassment as Thompson photographed the knife and placed it in an evidence bag, documenting its location and condition for the formal report that would inevitably follow. The visible proof of weapons involvement elevated the incident from a simple altercation to a potentially career-ending violation of military regulations and federal law. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, you appear to be injured," Thompson observed, noting the way Rodriguez continued favoring his right wrist. "I'm going to call for medical personnel to evaluate your condition before we proceed with witness interviews." The arrival of Navy medical personnel 15 minutes later created another wave of attention from Marines who had been trying to return to their normal routines. Rodriguez's injured wrist was examined, x-rayed using portable equipment, and diagnosed as suffering from severe strain and minor ligament damage, consistent with the joint lock technique that multiple witnesses described seeing Sarah employ. While Rodriguez received medical treatment, Thompson conducted preliminary interviews with the Marines, who had witnessed various portions of the confrontation. The consistency of their accounts surprised him, as most incident investigations involved contradictory statements that required extensive analysis to determine probable facts. In this case, every witness described essentially the same sequence of events, from the initial dining hall confrontation to Rodriguez's decision to draw a knife and Sarah's subsequent neutralization of the threat he represented. Lance Corporal Peterson proved to be one of the most articulate witnesses, providing Thompson with a detailed timeline that began with Rodriguez's initial approach to Sarah's table and concluded with her systematic demonstration of superior combat skills. "Master Sergeant, I've seen Rodriguez in a lot of fights over the years, and I've never seen anybody handle him like that. She made it look easy, like she was training a recruit instead of fighting for real." Private First Class Williams corroborated Peterson's account, while adding details about Rodriguez's increasing desperation as Sarah neutralized each of his attacks. He kept getting madder because nothing he tried was working. When she countered that first charge, I thought maybe she got lucky, but after a few minutes it was obvious she knew exactly what she was doing. The most damaging testimony came from Lance Corporal Jackson, who had recorded portions of the confrontation with his phone and provided clear evidence of Rodriguez drawing the knife while Sarah attempted to de-escalate the situation. You can see right here where she tells him that drawing a weapon will end his career, but he does it anyway. Then she takes him down so fast I had to watch it in slow motion to see what actually happened. Thompson reviewed Jackson's video recording multiple times, noting Sarah's calm warnings about the consequences of weapons involvement, and Rodriguez's aggressive response to her attempts at preventing further escalation. The footage provided irrefutable evidence that Sarah had acted in self-defense against an armed opponent who had initiated both the verbal and physical confrontation. After completing witness interviews, Thompson turned his attention to the primary participants, beginning with Rodriguez while he waited for medical clearance to participate in formal questioning. The staff sergeant's account of events proved to be inconsistent and defensive, attempting to justify his actions through claims about Sarah's disrespectful attitude and his responsibility to maintain Marine Corps standards. "Master Sergeant, she came into our dining hall acting like she owned the place," Rodriguez said, his voice still carrying traces of the anger that had initiated the confrontation. "When I tried to explain Marine Corps traditions and expectations, she got smart with me and started talking down to me in front of my Marines." Thompson had conducted enough similar interviews to recognize the self-serving distortions that typically followed incidents where service members faced serious disciplinary consequences. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, multiple witnesses describe you as the aggressor throughout this confrontation, both verbally and physically."
They also indicate that Lieutenant Chen repeatedly attempted to de-escalate the situation through professional dialogue.
The mention of Sarah's rank and name surprised Rodriguez, who realized for the first time that he had never bothered to learn basic information about the person he had chosen to intimidate and assault. His assumptions about her background and qualifications were proving to be catastrophically wrong, in ways that extended far beyond her unexpected combat capabilities. Thompson's interview with Sarah presented a stark contrast to Rodriguez's defensive and contradictory statements. Her account of events was precise, professional, and completely consistent with witness testimony and physical evidence. She provided specific details about Rodriguez's escalating behavior, while acknowledging her own role in the confrontation's progression. "Master Sergeant Thompson, I want to emphasize that I made multiple attempts to resolve our disagreement through dialogue and de-escalation techniques," Sarah said, her voice maintaining the same calm tone that had characterized her behavior throughout the incident. "I only used physical force when Staff Sergeant Rodriguez drew a weapon and created a situation where I believed my safety was at immediate risk." Thompson nodded while taking notes, impressed by Sarah's clinical recounting of events that must have been stressful despite her apparent composure. "Lieutenant Chen, the witness statements and video evidence support your version of events completely. However, I need to ask about your background and training, as several Marines commented that your combat techniques appeared to exceed standard military instruction." Sarah's expression remained neutral as she considered how much information about her background could be shared without violating security protocols. Her assignments and training involved classified elements that couldn't be discussed in detail, even with military police conducting official investigations. "Master Sergeant, I can confirm that my training includes advanced combat techniques beyond standard Navy instruction," Sarah said carefully. "The specific details of that training aren't appropriate for discussion in this context, but I can provide you with contact information from my commanding officer who can verify my qualifications and background." Thompson understood the implications of Sarah's carefully worded response, recognizing that he was dealing with someone whose military background included elements that required security clearances and official verification. The professional manner in which he handled his questions reinforced his growing assessment that Rodriguez had picked a fight with someone whose capabilities far exceeded his own. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Thompson's commanding officer arrived at the scene after receiving reports about the incident's unusual circumstances. Colonel Patricia Hawkins had spent 30 years in military police work and had never encountered a case quite like what the witness statements and evidence suggested had occurred behind the Camp Pendleton dining hall.
Master Sergeant Thompson, Colonel Hawkins said after reviewing his preliminary findings, I want you to expedite Lieutenant Chen's background verification through proper channels. Something about this situation suggests we're dealing with personnel whose training and assignments are beyond typical military police jurisdiction. The colonel's instincts proved correct when Thompson's inquiry to Sarah's commanding officer revealed information that transformed the incident from a simple altercation to a case study in what happened when untrained personnel challenged individuals with classified special operations backgrounds. The details provided by Sarah's command structure couldn't be shared widely, but they confirmed that Rodriguez had essentially picked a fight with one of the most lethal individuals on the entire military base. As the investigation progressed through official channels, Rodriguez found himself facing charges that included assault on a fellow service member, brandishing a weapon during a dispute, conduct unbecoming a non-commissioned officer, and violation of multiple military regulations governing interactions between service members. The witness testimony and video evidence made denial impossible, leaving him with limited options for avoiding serious disciplinary consequences. Sarah's actions were reviewed through different channels appropriate to her security clearance and operational background. The investigation confirmed that she had acted appropriately throughout the confrontation, using only necessary force to neutralize a legitimate threat, while making repeated attempts to prevent escalation to physical violence. The contrast between their respective situations became clear as the formal charges were prepared and reviewed by appropriate authorities. Rodriguez faced court-martial proceedings that would likely result in reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay, and probable discharge from the Marine Corps. Sarah faced a routine after-action review that was expected to conclude with commendation for her professional handling of an unexpected threat situation. Word of the investigation's findings spread through Camp Pendleton's rumor network faster than official communications could travel. Marines throughout the base began learning that the small Navy officer who had systematically dismantled one of their supposed tough guys was actually a decorated special operations veteran whose combat record included classified missions that couldn't be discussed in detail. The transformation in how Sarah was perceived by base personnel became apparent immediately. Marines who had initially viewed her as an outsider began treating her with the respectful deference typically reserved for individuals whose combat credentials were beyond question. The incident that Rodriguez had intended as a demonstration of Marine superiority became instead a lesson about the dangers of making assumptions based on appearance rather than actual qualifications and experience. As the investigation moved toward formal resolution, Rodriguez began understanding the full magnitude of his errors in judgment and their likely consequences for his military career and future prospects. 3 weeks after the incident behind the dining hall, Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez sat in the waiting area outside the commanding officer's office, his dress blue uniform perfectly pressed despite the nervous sweat that had begun forming under his collar. The formal court-martial proceedings had concluded the previous day, and today he would learn the official consequences of his decision to challenge someone whose background and capabilities he had completely misjudged. The investigation had revealed details about Rodriguez's pattern of behavior that extended far beyond his confrontation with Sarah Chen. Multiple Marines had come forward during the proceedings to describe similar incidents where Rodriguez had used intimidation and physical threats to establish dominance over service members he perceived as weak or unworthy of respect. The picture that emerged was of a non-commissioned officer whose leadership style relied on bullying rather than the professional example expected from Marines in positions of authority. Colonel James Morrison called Rodriguez into his office with the grave expression of someone who had spent considerable time reviewing the case file and witness statements. The colonel had served in combat zones throughout his career and understood the difference between aggressive leadership under pressure and the systematic intimidation of fellow service members that Rodriguez had practiced during his assignment at Camp Pendleton. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Colonel Morrison began, his voice carrying the weight of official judgment. The court-martial panel has reached its decision regarding the charges filed against you following the incident with Lieutenant Chen. Before I announce their findings, I want to address the broader pattern of behavior that this investigation has revealed about your conduct as a non-commissioned officer." Rodriguez maintained his position at attention while fighting the urge to offer explanations or justifications that he knew would be inappropriate during formal sentencing. The past 3 weeks had given him time to reflect on the choices that had led to this moment, and the clarity of hindsight had shown him just how badly he had misjudged both the situation and his opponent. "The panel has found you guilty on all charges," Colonel Morrison continued, consulting the official documentation before him. "Assault on a fellow service member, brandishing a weapon during a dispute, conduct unbecoming a non-commissioned officer, and multiple violations of military regulations governing professional interactions. The severity of these charges, combined with testimony about your pattern of similar behavior, has led to the following sentence." The sentence was devastating, but not entirely unexpected given the evidence presented during the court-martial. Rodriguez would be reduced in rank to Lance Corporal, forfeit 2 months' pay, serve 60 days in the brig, and receive an other-than-honorable discharge from the Marine Corps upon completion of his confinement. His military career was effectively over, and his future employment prospects would be significantly limited by the circumstances of his discharge. Colonel Morrison's expression softened slightly as he delivered the final portion of Rodriguez's sentence. However, the panel also noted Lieutenant Chen's recommendation for leniency in your case. Despite your unprovoked assault and the threat you posed with a deadly weapon, she has requested that you be given an opportunity to demonstrate genuine rehabilitation rather than simply facing maximum punishment. The mention of Sarah's intervention on his behalf stunned Rodriguez more than any physical blow she had delivered during their confrontation. After everything he had put her through, from public humiliation to armed assault, she had actually spoken in favor of giving him a chance to redeem himself and salvage some possibility of a future beyond his military disgrace. As a result of Lieutenant Chen's recommendation and your previously clean disciplinary record, you will be eligible to apply for an upgrade of your discharge characterization after 1 year, provided you can demonstrate significant personal growth and community service during that time period. This is an unusual opportunity, Staff Sergeant, and I strongly suggest you make the most of it. Rodriguez's dismissal from the colonel's office marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one that would require him to confront the insecurities and aggressive tendencies that had led to his downfall. The 60 days in the brig provided time for reflection that he had been avoiding for years, forcing him to examine the gap between the Marine he thought he was and the person his actions had revealed him to be. Meanwhile, Sarah continued her assignment at Camp Pendleton with a dramatically altered reputation among the Marines she worked with daily. The incident with Rodriguez had established her credibility in ways that months of professional interaction might not have achieved, earning her the kind of respect typically reserved for combat veterans whose capabilities had been proven under fire. Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Santos, Sarah's immediate supervisor for the training program she had been assigned to develop, called her into a meeting to discuss the incident's impact on her mission effectiveness. The colonel had read the classified portions of Sarah's background file and understood the unique qualifications she brought to the inter-service cooperation initiatives that were becoming increasingly important in modern military operations. "Lieutenant Chen, I want to address the elephant in the room regarding your confrontation with Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Colonel Santos began, her tone professional but warm. "While I wish the circumstances had been different, the incident has actually enhanced your credibility with the Marines you're training. They now understand that your expertise comes from real-world experience rather than just theoretical knowledge." Sarah nodded while considering the irony of how Rodriguez's attempt to humiliate her had instead established her reputation more effectively than any formal introduction or credential review could have accomplished. "Colonel, I regret that the situation escalated to violence, but I'm glad if it helps the Marines take the training programs more seriously. Joint operations require trust and respect between services, and that can only be built on mutual recognition of each other's capabilities." The training program Sarah had been developing focused on the kind of close-quarters combat and asymmetric warfare techniques that had become essential in modern military operations. Her real-world experience in classified missions provided insights that couldn't be found in manuals or traditional training scenarios, and the Marines now approached her instruction with the attention and respect it deserved. Private First Class Williams, who had been one of Rodriguez's most enthusiastic supporters before witnessing his complete defeat, became one of Sarah's most dedicated students in the Advanced Combat Techniques course she taught twice weekly. His transformation from skeptical follower to eager learner illustrated the broader change in attitude that Sarah's demonstration had created among the Marines at Camp Pendleton. "Ma'am, I wanted to apologize for my attitude during that incident in the dining hall," Williams said after one of Sarah's training sessions. "I should have recognized that you knew what you were talking about instead of just assuming Rodriguez was right about everything." Sarah appreciated the young Marine's honesty while using his admission as a teaching moment about the dangers of making assumptions in combat situations. Private Williams, the ability to quickly and accurately assess threats and capabilities can mean the difference between life and death in real operations. What happened with Staff Sergeant Rodriguez should serve as a reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and respect should be based on demonstrated competence rather than physical intimidation. The months following the incident saw significant improvements in the effectiveness of the inter-service training programs Sarah had been assigned to develop. Marines approached the instruction with genuine interest rather than skeptical resistance, and the techniques she taught began appearing in their performance during joint exercises with other military branches. Rodriguez's time in confinement provided opportunities for personal growth that he had never pursued during his active duty service. The Marine Corps provided access to counseling services and educational programs designed to help service members address the underlying issues that had contributed to their disciplinary problems. For the first time in years, Rodriguez began examining the insecurities and anger that had driven his need to dominate others through intimidation. The counseling sessions revealed patterns of behavior that traced back to Rodriguez's childhood experiences with bullying and his subsequent decision to become the aggressor rather than continue being a victim. Understanding these psychological roots didn't excuse his actions, but it provided a framework for developing healthier ways of interacting with others and building genuine self-confidence rather than the fragile ego he had protected through aggression. Upon his release from confinement, Rodriguez faced the challenge of rebuilding his life outside the military structure that had defined his identity for 6 years. The other than honorable discharge limited his employment options significantly, but Sarah's recommendation for leniency had preserved the possibility of upgrading his discharge status if he could demonstrate genuine rehabilitation. Rodriguez's first step toward redemption involved reaching out to Sarah through official channels to request a meeting where he could apologize properly for his actions and thank her for her unexpected advocacy on his behalf. The meeting took place in Colonel Santos's office, with appropriate supervision to ensure professional conduct from both parties. "Lieutenant Chen, I know that nothing I can say will undo the harm I caused or justify my behavior during our confrontation," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying genuine remorse rather than the aggressive confidence that had characterized their previous interactions. "I want to thank you for speaking on my behalf during the court-martial proceedings, and I want you to know that I'm committed to proving worthy of the second chance your recommendation has given me." Sarah listened to Rodriguez's apology with the same calm attention she had maintained throughout their original confrontation, though her expression showed genuine appreciation for his apparent growth and self-reflection. "Marcus, what matters now is not what happened in the past, but what you choose to do with the opportunities you still have. The Marine Corps taught you valuable skills and discipline that can serve you well in civilian life if you apply them constructively." The meeting concluded with Rodriguez receiving information about veterans' services and educational programs that could help him transition to civilian employment while addressing the personal issues that had contributed to his military downfall. Sarah's final words to him emphasized the importance of using his experience to help other veterans avoid similar mistakes rather than simply focusing on his own rehabilitation. 6 months after his discharge, Rodriguez had enrolled in community college courses while working part-time as a security guard, using the structure and discipline of his educational goals to rebuild his self-confidence through achievement rather than intimidation. He had also begun volunteering with veteran support groups, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about the consequences of letting insecurities and anger control professional behavior. Sarah completed her assignment at Camp Pendleton with commendations for the effectiveness of her training programs and the positive impact she had made on inter-service cooperation initiatives. The incident that Rodriguez had intended as a demonstration of her weakness had instead become a foundation for some of the most successful joint training programs the base had ever implemented. The final chapter of their story came 2 years later, when Rodriguez successfully petitioned for an upgrade of his discharge status. Based on his educational achievements,
community service record, and the positive recommendations from counselors and employers who had witnessed his transformation. The upgrade to general under honorable conditions restored many of the benefits he had lost and opened new possibilities for federal employment and veteran services. In the letter accompanying his upgrade petition, Rodriguez included a detailed account of how Sarah's unexpected compassion had given him the motivation to rebuild his life, rather than succumb to bitterness and despair. Her example of responding to aggression with professionalism and her advocacy for second chances had taught him more about true strength and leadership than all his years of trying to dominate others through intimidation. The Marine who had tried to humiliate a Navy SEAL at lunch had indeed ended his career before it began, but the story's conclusion proved that sometimes the most devastating defeats can become the foundation for genuine personal growth and redemption. Sarah's demonstration that day had been about more than combat techniques. It had been a masterclass in how true warriors handle conflict with both strength and mercy.